Hello, I'm Alan Scott, producer and director of the Winsconsin project video. Please join me and TTNA Productions and we'll take you back in time and the real discovery of the New World. You're about to see a quest of a younger man's journey, a Mohican man who discovered something so profound while on a hunting trip. It would only begin revealing itself to him 40 years later, until he was found worthy of its telling, taking him from his world to the realm of the Knights Templar.
In the 1980s, I returned back to our tribal lands to hunt. The police department, with the homicides and the shootings and the robberies, it gets pretty wearing on someone. And so going back to tribal lands was also a chance to heal. It was a chance to kind of declutter all the things that happened in the last week. But I knew once I got back there, I was going to encounter a feeling that I have encountered many times back there as a young man and a middle-aged man and as an older man. There was this feeling of being misplaced. This feeling would haunt me. It would, sometimes when I would be there, I wouldn't know where I was at for 2 minutes, 5 minutes, sometimes a half hour, even though I'd hunted these lands for 40 years. It was a mystery that I couldn't explain, and I have never really shared with the outside. It's just something that we don't talk about. And upon coming to a rock ledge, I was kind of mystified by this because it was something that I had never seen before in all my years of hunting back there. And I came across what I thought was a cave, and because of the animals we have, the mountain lions and bears, and I wanted to be safe, so I had thrown a stick inside. When I felt comfortable, I climbed over a large rock that must have had fallen off the top. And once I made my way over it, I entered into this cave, and that's when I realized that this wasn't a natural cave. It had all the appearances of being man-made. The walls were flat at 90 degrees. And it almost appeared that someone had placed a large round rock on the top. It was faced, it had been worked. It had just made the mystery even more. The feeling of being displaced, now finding a man-made structure. And it wasn't until 2018, when I had returned to these lands, that I discovered something else. In my search for a team, as an investigator, I started to search the world over. I was able to make contact with Sean Williamson from Scotland. He is also from the Clan Gunn family that worked closely with the Sinclairs. Sean is a master stonemason, and he's also an ancient stone master. He has great knowledge on stone carving, the techniques used, and the ability to examine an existing carving and determine how it was carved and what type of instruments were used to carve that. Sean also makes a lot of his own tools for carving, so he understands these carving techniques. He is an expert on Knights Templar, their history, their travels. He worked with the late Andrew Sinclair. and inherited all of his work. And Sean has also sailed the Great Lakes and became familiar with Native Americans. Sean had worked with a film producer by the name of Alan Scott in the past and thought that he might be a good fit for our team. So I interviewed Alan, and I found out that when he was about 15 years old, he had left home because he had such a passion when he saw a motion picture one time, and he wanted to learn every aspect he could of how these films were made. This led him on to become an assistant film cameraman, freelancing for two main TV networks. One was the BBC, and one was ITV television. And then he went to work for many TV newsrooms as he gained more experience. In working for the BBC, he was filming many documentaries, so he had a great understanding of how to do this. Alan also presented his own version of what he saw in his mind. He wanted to be so authentic, without the slightest chance of being misleading. And when Alan and I discussed this at great length, and that was always his thoughts, to tell it as truthfully and accurately as possible, that's when Alan Scott joined Team Templar North America. I came across Ken Keyser. He had introduced himself through a message to me one day, and through subsequent conversations, I got to learn a little bit more about Ken. Ken is what I'd call a graduate of life. He had worked in the building trades from a very young man growing up, sometimes in pretty difficult situations. And then as Ken got older and started doing research, he would send me some of his work. That's where I learned that Ken looks at things in a different way. Ken has this natural ability to put himself in, say, the Vikings' position at that time, the 1100s, and try to come to a possible solution, what they would have done, how they would have acted. And he has applied this research technique and made some great discoveries with Team Templar. So his ability to look at some things that others miss has been a great value to Team Templar. Ken is also a web designer for us and our archivist. He wears many hats. But when you put this entire team together, you have four very distinct people who are seeking nothing but the truth in this. If it turns out to be that it was just carvings on a rock, so be it. But all the evidence is pointing to pre-Columbian travel. And we like to say that at Team Templar that we don't search for gold or silver, we search for truth. Because in finding that truth, there we will find our treasure.
The telling of the story and of who and when the New World was discovered should have started out as a fable. History and its secrets and its accounts were as always as controversial as the person who was telling the story. Travel to the New World could have been as early as 800 AD by the Irish or Celts, as indicated in their sagas. Probably it was the sense of adventure in the very beginning, but as the vast wealth of the New World was discovered, the game had changed. As quickly as the Europeans began to burn through their natural resources, the slaughter of their seal population, the walrus and its ivory and the wealth it provided would require new hunting grounds. History tells us that the beaches of Scotland, Orkneys and the Faroe Islands all ran red with blood of the spring walrus hunt. The natural time that nature had set aside for breeding purposes and the continuation of a species. This would eventually be called Eastern Clade Walrus as an identifier. The declining number of whales and catchable fish now required deeper travels into the oceans. Furs and rare falcon, valued by the kings of Muslim countries, who would pay vast sums, spurred the Vikings to the Atlantic and on to the New World for sport and profit. A world so rich in natural resources, gold, copper, silver, was laying on the ground and in the rivers. A world so rich in its natural resources, walrus, seals, falcons, by the thousand, lined the beaches of Hudson Bay. Its waters teemed with whales, even the legendary narwhale, whose tusk once was used by a pope as a cane, now sitting in a museum in Europe. Vast shoals of fish were there for the taking. The western clade walrus was even now more valuable than the depleted walrus population of Europe. The western walrus ivory could be polished to a high sheen, white, and the Chinese and Muslim countries wanted even more. At one point, its value was greater than gold. Walrus ivory was even used once to pay ransom to release a prince from the King of Norway. There was only one problem: the Native Americans, who had lived there for thousands of years. Would they trade, or would other means have to be used? Staying out of sight, the Native Americans observed the travellers, when their way of killing for sport and profit became apparent. The Native Americans fought back, protecting their way of life, but the travellers' absence would only last for a while. Within years, more and more of these travellers began to arrive. Small trade was established. As demand for trade increased, so did the tensions. A concept the Europeans couldn't understand. The Native Americans weren't interested in making or taking profit. The land gave the Native Americans everything they needed: a home, food, medicine, clothes and security for their families. The oceans gave even more. Taking only what they needed, the natural resources would continue for generations to come. This was about to change, and it wasn't going well for the Native Americans and their peoples. Outbreaks began to occur, tensions increased, and so did the presence of a new killer silently arrived. At first, unnoticed, but not for long. Diseases common in Europe were unknown in the New World and would release hell on these unsuspecting peoples and their way of life. As time turned the pages, a new traveller appeared, dressed in a white robe and displaying a red cross, carrying a large sword and wearing metal skin. The travellers looked tired and weary, as if fleeing an enemy that may be common to both the Native Americans and the Templars. Taking a knee and lowering the head, placing the weapon on the ground, indicated these travellers wanted peace. Time passed, trust grew, and the sharing of ideas began to take hold. This would then become evident in future drawings and writings of others. This would continue as evidence began to appear in the woods of the later-day home of the Mohican people now living in Wisconsin. This would be one day slowly revealed to lead investigator Wayne Murphy. It appears a 40-year trial was required of him. Would he rise to meet this challenge? Would he be found worthy of its telling? The finding of a cave or possible tomb unknowingly started an ancient clock ticking.